quote, "Sentimentalism and a misplaced sense of tradition, alongside a denial of the scale and complexity of the necessary work, has blinded some politicians to the urgency of the situation." These are words from Caroline Shenton, author of Fixing Westminster, taken from a recent issue of the London Review of Books. They're words that could apply to any number of real moments of political crisis. But what the author has on her mind is the decay of the Parliament building that houses British democracy, and the obstacles to restoring Westminster. It's Shenton's first ever piece published in the LRB, and she bemoans the state of utter disrepair of a structure she describes as, quote, "a masterpiece of Victorian architecture and a spectacular feat of civil engineering, built literally and perhaps metaphorically on 8 acres of quicksand." The Parliament building needs to be restored quickly, and things don't look good. This is the LRB Trip Report. It's hard to imagine somebody with more authority on the Parliament building than Shenton. Having all the expertise of somebody who has visited her site, I can tell you that she was a senior archivist at the British National Archives before becoming director of the Parliamentary Archives. She teaches history to postgrads at the University of Dundee and gives talks about the Parliament building. Her book, The Day Parliament Burned Down, was an award winner. As Shenton tells it, when it was announced in 1860 that construction of the new Houses of Parliament would be delayed, commissioned architect Charles Barry, the Barry of Shenton's other book, Mr. Barry's War, Barry was furious. His colleague working on the interior design told him he couldn't see how Barry would be able to keep faith in the project. Shenton expresses reverential admiration for Barry, who, despite, quote, "constant interference from politicians and, quote, the schemes of crackpot inventors and busybodies, he heroically saw the project to its completion at 3 times the proposed budget, 24 years late." She uses the story of Barry's professional frustration as a springboard to bring attention to the structural plight of the Parliament building today. Shenton shines her light on its extreme decay, its sewers and its steam systems, its rodent infestation and its problem with asbestos, its corroded roof and its crumbling stonework. The building doesn't meet fire safety standards. The heating system could, quote, "blow at any time." Depending on how much the government is willing to pay, and the physical inconvenience members of Parliament are willing to endure, the restoration is projected to take between 6 and, wait for it, 32 years. MPs are scheduled to vote on a restoration plan in early 2019. But with political instability in the UK and Brexit imminent, it means it's likely further delays are to be expected. If history repeats itself, MPs will be reluctant to embrace the inconvenience, which could speed up the restoration process and make it less costly. Shenton is convinced that everybody is blind to the urgency of the situation, due in part to the sentimentalism cited in the opening. She quotes the first Commissioner of Works from a Commons committee in 1844, who insisted on the need to place greater control in the hands of Barry, the expert architect, in order to avoid mismanagement. Shenton closes her piece by imagining the ghost of heroic architect Barry finding the current situation, quote, "horribly familiar." My summary barely shortens her piece, which runs at a lean, mean 1,300 words. Shenton's closing line, which imagines the severe judgment of the ghost of Barry, isn't quite apocalyptic, but it left me feeling haunted. This is a short essay about an important building crumbling, and it could be read as an attempt to say something radical in a way that escapes the censorship of authorities, both internal and external. Authorities for whom any questioning of democracy is heresy. I stumbled onto something about the tactics Chinese novelists use to avoid censorship, and it got me thinking about Shenton's piece. Maybe I'm just pointing out the obvious, but if you wanted to criticize democracy as a form of government, pointing at the democratic difficulty of maintaining and repairing its central building wouldn't be a bad place to start. Even the harshest censors wouldn't be able to shoot down a useful, transparent plea to save a historical building, even if that article makes that task sound impossible in a democracy. So rereading it, the piece began to feel loaded with meaning, as if I was getting lost analyzing a dream with a Freudian. Tiny details were semiotic invitations. Shenton mentions mice, rats, and moths that are, quote, everywhere. How can they not bring to mind timid bureaucrats who survive only by staying out of sight, or relentless, clever cannibals who prosper close to power? When you're down on the people in power in general, everybody in a parliament building begins to resemble a moth, drawn irresistibly and hopelessly to the warm flame of influence in its discontents. Even the historical lessons Shenton draws from the heroic construction of the building by the incredibly patient Barry can begin to seem dark. This isn't 1850, and it's not clear which democratic experiences recorded by history should be didactic. Maybe, in this case, there isn't much to be learned from the past. And where is the horror in the, quote, horribly familiar present described by Barry's ghost? Presumably, it lies in the constant delays, the ballooning expenses, and the chaotic implementation of a constantly changing plan that the real Barry understood all too well. But aren't these all symptoms of, well, democracy? If this is just history repeating itself for a historian, what's so horrible about it? Maybe her piece should be read as a celebration of the patience of architects. But it sure didn't read that way. Efficient execution of major construction projects has never been the strength of democracies. In fact, to iterate a cliché, efficiency in general isn't the main appeal of democratic governments. It's the ability to change course before it's too late.
Democracies have made fewer, or at least bad mistakes than rival systems, less bad mistakes than rival systems. The mistakes they've made, they've tended to correct. They've woken up in time. They've faced repeated crises. They've stumbled to the edge of the cliff, and they've stumbled back. And I think it would be crazy to think that that pattern is sure to repeat itself for the next 100 years. And I think there are reasons to think that that model, that reactive model, that democracy is the best system because it's the one that can react in time to stop the disaster, that model is likely to persist.
That's Cambridge professor of politics David Runciman, and that was not an efficient process he was describing. Runciman isn't sure that democracies will survive the current constellation of technological change, economic shocks, and imminent environmental disaster. In the face of disaster and a system that has a hard time repairing its central building, some thinkers simply might say that democracy is an idea whose time is up. You don't need to look far for examples of authoritarian governments, think of a place like Singapore, where planners are able to simply get things done by not giving a shit about individual people and the sloppiness of democratic oversight. Somebody like Slavoj Žižek comes back again and again to the apocalyptic crises that, for him, are a cause for despair about democracy, but also an opportunity to rethink communism.
The only thing, this is why I remain a communist, there is one thing, the only really important thing from all this, the basic message is that we are approaching a series of problems. Economic, new apartheids, new poverty, new hunger, ecological problems, how to deal with biogenetics and so on, and that it's becoming more and more clear that neither the market nor the state, or combination of states, will do the job.
I doubt Shenton is a communist. I mentioned earlier that for her, the Parliament building is, quote, a masterpiece of Victorian architecture and a marvel of civil engineering. But can your political leanings be in the direction of a building? Or hers? I wonder what she thinks democratic officials can do to save the Parliament building and to do it quickly. If there aren't realistic democratic remedies, is it realistic to think people will just watch it crumble without recourse to something a bit more drastic than chaotic, inefficient, creep to the edge of the cliff and turn back democracy? Shenton may have intended to write a straightforward, understated, and transparent piece. She may simply have wanted to point at some helpful facts about the past of a government building. But in the process, at least in my reading, she accidentally wrote a short, disturbing piece about the threats to democracy. She slipped by the censors, mine at least. So for readers prone to wonder about big, structural, sometimes invisible things needing to be repaired outside the walls of Parliament, Shenton's piece can't help but stir up some dangerous thoughts. Thanks to Julien Vezo for help with the music, and thanks to Aliel for the audio recording. I'm Connor Cody.